Hi everyone, I'm Josh. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to give you my first ever, if you like this, then you should read this. And I'm going to do my best to make these sort of some unique reads. I feel like I see a lot of these, and too often, not to call anyone out, but too often, it's like, if you like this popular book, you should read this popular book. When, like, obviously, if you heard about these two books independently, they probably already know they're similar, obviously. My goal here is to say, if you like this popular book, I think you'll like this lesser well-known book that should be getting more attention from my not-so-humble opinion. Now, I chose to do this video specifically because someone asked me to do it. I mean, I invited some requests, and someone was kind enough to post it in the comments, which I'm very appreciative. I'm here, I'm doing it, hopefully you get through the video without my phone crashing. Although, before I get started, we're going to tell you, if you have any requests on type of videos you'd like to see, throw it in the comments. I'll try my best to make it happen, as long as it's not too ambitious. I never know what people want to see versus what I like to do, and I wouldn't mind, exploring new things. If it's something you want, just throw it down below. I have now 10 books, let me phrase that, 10 stacks of books. I say stacks because not all of them are one-to-one. Some of them I have multiple popular books to compare to a lesser known one. Some of them I have a popular book with a couple lesser known ones. And hopefully by the time we're done, you'll find some books that might actually intrigue you. All right, first up is going to be the very popular Cersei by Madeline Miller. So for those of you who know, this is the story of Cersei. She's the witch who basically trapped Odysseus. Is that his name? I think his name's Odysseus, for like years on her island. And she's often created or often depicted as this monster who sort of took advantage or trapped Odysseus on her island and forced him to stay, turned his men into pigs, and until eventually they were able to escape. This book reframes that perspective. It looks at Cersei as the victim, as a woman who's often mischaracterized and villainized just for existing and being herself, and having to deal with people with aggressive, invasive people like Odysseus and his men trying to invade her space. And this is about reframing that story and telling it the way it likely probably would have happened. Let's be honest. If the Greek gods were real, this story is more realistic than that. Because if there's one thing the Greek gods are, they are reflections of humanity. And humanity is just a massive patriarchal piece of shit. Starting off strong on this video. So what am I going to recommend here? I have two, actually. First one I want to recommend is an obvious book that I think intentionally tried to become Cersei. And in that sense, it's not quite as good as Cersei because it's really just trying to mimic it. But this is called The Witch's Heart, which is basically a story about Angrboda. She is, I don't know if you call her a witch, but she's basically a type of witch who ends up being the wife of Loki in Norse mythology. I'm not as familiar with Norse mythology, so I didn't have the same investment in this as I did Cersei, but it's still interesting seeing her story and how the original mythology may have come together. Like, I can imagine how that might have done. I'm not as familiar with Norse mythology, but I thought it was a solid book. Nowhere near as good as Cersei, but still one that I think if you like the idea of a retelling to a woman's perspective, this was a good one to go with. It's also interesting because it reframes the Greek gods, the Norse gods. Loki, his brother, his father. I'm so used to seeing them in MCU as these particular, like, really goody two-shoes, and Loki being the bad guy, and it's interesting seeing that perspective reframed from, again, the more realistic perspective of these being toxic, patriarchal men. And the next up is one that I actually liked a lot more than Witch's Heart, that I highly recommend, even if it's not the exact sort of approach as Cersei, but it is 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. This one I feel like is probably more well-known than The Witch's Heart, but still not as well-known as it should be. This is the story of the Battle of Troy, the War of Troy, whatever you called it, the thing that happened at Troy, where, there was this massive attempt to steal, what was her name? I already forgot, but this was the beautiful woman who was, quote-unquote, taken by the people of Troy, or the Prince of Troy or something, from one of the people from the Greek mythology. I know this really known name, like Agamemnon, whatever his name is. I think his wife or something like that, get taken, so they start this war trying to get her back. This isn't about them. This is about the women in the story from both sides, not just the woman that's being pulled or being used as a pawn of sorts, but also the women who are royalty, the women who are on the streets, the women who are gods, I believe, or even play a part in here. Basically, we jump perspectives in every chapter where we get to see what it was like to be a woman in this tale. And I know that Natalie Haynes is an expert in Greek mythology, so this was really, really good. And what really impressed me was how she was able to take these different perspectives in every chapter and make them interwoven in a way that works really well as an overarching narrative, despite being independent narratives. And I know that's not unique to these type of stories, but sometimes they don't work that well, and I feel like it can be disconcerting. This one, I feel like it worked really well, and I highly recommend this if you liked Cersei, quite frankly. Next up, we're going to keep going strong with some ambitious recommendations here, because the next one we're talking about is Middle Game by Sean McGuire. And if you know me, you know this is one of my favorite books of all time. Now, I should say, when I recommend these books that are coming up next, I love both of them, but they're not Middle Game, okay? I'm not recommending them because they're the best thing ever, but because I feel they share similar themes to Middle Game, and because I think they're also good in their own right, if not quite as good as Middle Game. What is Middle Game? It is the story of these basic, highly, what's the word? They start with an A? Fuck me. It starts with a goddamn A. Alchemy. You have these alchemists trying to take over the world by creating these creations who embody basically the fundamental laws of nature. And while it's heavy in the fantasy, I think it's a nice intersection of sci-fi fantasy, while also revolving around some central characters and trying to prevent basically the end of the world. Because if these people win, they're going to be able to take over the world. It's the end of the world. And that's a big thing that I'm focusing on here, because these next two books deal with the intersection of science and fantasy, but also the end of the world, the potential end of the world that could, it seems to be happening because of certain things going on. First up is going to be the first 15 lives of Harry August. This is a Groundhog's narrative. Middle Game itself is a sort of Groundhog's narrative because it's sort of a time loop scenario, but this is very different. This is the story of Harry August, who every time he dies, he wakes up, he's reborn with all of his memories. And this book is sort of split into two parts. One where he's telling the story of his life and what it's like to be him, and somewhat in a non-linear fashion, because this story of the 15 lives, his 15 lives, or him telling the narrative at the end of these 15 lives, or at least the first 15. I'm not saying he dies at the end. Maybe he does. We don't know. But on top of that, what's happening is while we're beginning to understand his life and what it means to be what he is, we begin to realize something unique is happening in every life. Every time he's reliving his life, something shouldn't be changing. But for some reason, the end of the world is happening, and it's getting closer and closer with every life, suggesting something is happening beyond him to alter the timeline, alter the nature itself. And what we find is sort of this alternate force which is causing this to happen. Simultaneously, Harry finds himself in this unique position in this world where he has sort of a connection with the entity that is sort of causing all this to happen. In a lot of ways, there's this sort of intimacy between them. It's like love-hate relationship, almost queer to an extent. But that's one problem I have with this book, is that I think it hints at queerness without actually going there, which I have a problem with in retrospect. But all in all, it's really effective in how it sort of looks at this sort of time loop meshed up with this sort of doomsday scenario and the ways in which Harry himself might be contributing to it or not, and how we could stop it. And it was just really, really good. And when I think about Middle Game, this has similar traits that make me think about it. There's a reason I love both of these, because they have these similar sci-fi fantasy doomsday tropes. Next up is a similar scenario, obviously, because I'm recommending it. All the Birds in the Sky by Charlie Jane Anders. This, in a lot of ways, I think is more similar to Middle Game. And this is the story of basically a witch falling in love with a scientist. And similar to Harry August, this is the story of two individuals clashing, because you have these two opposing forces, both as magic and science, but also on a fundamental level of who they are as people, sort of clashing. And there seems to be this end of the world scenario that's being caused by one of the two sides involved, and they have to try and prevent it, all the while reckon with this sort of relationship they have with one another. That relationship that is at the core of this one, and I think also at the core of Harry August, isn't quite there for Middle Game. In some ways, it might be like there's a sibling relationship in Middle Game, which the siblings aren't enemies, but like they also have a connection. So in a way, it's sort of there, but not quite as directly as Harry August in this book. But still, it's the overarching theme of science meeting magic and the end of the world looming because of the actions being done by these magicians or scientists involved. Honestly, I feel like I need to reread All the Birds in the Sky, because I haven't read that in years, and I barely remember a lot of the details besides the overarching plot. So let's pivot over to some nonfiction here. Now, All the Boys in the Sky. That's not right. All Boys Aren't Blue. Meshing up different titles now. This is a very popular book for good reason. At least in certain circles it's popular. This is a story of George M. Johnson growing up as what they originally identified as a queer boy. They've since come out as non-binary, but in this is their story. They're waking up or growing up as a queer masculine person, or who is not as masculine as traditionally expected of someone in their position. And it's just what it was like being them and their experience in dealing with their gender identity, which again, we realize now they've not come out as non-binary. In a similar scenario, we have always been here by Samra Habib. And this is essentially her story as an immigrant Canadian coming to Canada, I think from Pakistan, and she is Muslim and she's also queer. And this is her narrative as both as an immigrant experience, but reckoning with her own queerness in her religion. I think this takes a kinder look at religion and the forces opposing her than this, but there's still those similar themes of identity and the world around you not being accepting or meshing with your identity. So that's why I feel like we should be recommending this as the other. If you like this one, I'd recommend this one. This one doesn't have quite the same exploration of gender, which is here. I think it's probably a critical part of what makes this one so great in my eyes, but it's still interesting to see this exploration of what it means to be queer and how you reckon with that when everything around you tells you it's wrong. Okay. Let's go back to fiction. I only have 2 nonfiction recs, so sorry about that. The Shining by Stephen King. I think we all know what this is. A haunted hotel, and it wants to consume all of its visitors. Also, along that line of thinking, we have The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, a house that is seemingly alive, trying to consume its visitors. Whether or not it's alive isn't as obvious as it is in The Shining, but the similarities are definitely there. Now, I have these 2 that I want to recommend, but one of them is actually fairly popular already, so you can consider it sort of in between recommendation versus if you like this. But just like those 2 is The Haunting, that's not right, The Good House by Tenerife Dew. If you haven't heard of this, you really should read it if you like these other 2 books, because this is the same scenario. We have this house, which is essentially alive. It wants to consume the individuals there, but the forces that are causing it to be alive are slightly different than these other books, because this is rooted in Haitian voodoo mythology, and it's really interesting how Dew sort of weaves that into the story and makes it unique from the others in that perspective. At the same time, it still maintains that same sense of dread and anxiety and sort of the home being alive that we see in these other 2 books. This is really good. And I want to also recommend another book where the home is basically sort of alive, and that is White is for Witching by Helen Oyeyemi. And I have this gorgeous cover that I absolutely adore for this book. And this is a very basically gothic sort of dark romance, if you can call it a romance. It's not really a romance-centered story, but it's a story about this main character who feels sort of withdrawn from everyone. She has her girlfriend who I believe is, I can't remember if the girl who lives in the house is white and the girlfriend is black or the other way around. I want to say that the girl at the center of the story is white and her girlfriend who plays a part of the story is black. And there's that dynamic, there's a racial dynamic that comes into play in this book. But at the core of how this is similar to the other 2 books, or 3 really, is that there's something about the house that sort of pulls to the women of that family. And we see this sort of drawing her to it, almost wanting to consume her in the same way as the other books. This leans more gothic than it does horror. Even put it in the horror genre is a little bit of a stretch, but I still think if you like these other 2 books, you would like this. And if you're looking for a scare, maybe not. But there's more to these books than just being scary, in my opinion. And this really embodies that. It really is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, Helen Oyeyemi book, because it's just so effective at that sort of magical realism, weird gothic tone that is so often in her works. Okay, now both these books are actually kind of popular, or maybe not popular enough, I don't know. But I'm going to go with Luster, which I feel like was fairly popular when it came out. It's this sort of messy romance book about this 23-year-old woman who gets involved in this man who's in a marriage. It's a consensual, sort of platonic, not platonic, but it's an open marriage scenario. And it's very messy, to put it lightly. And we see the exploration of this dynamic and her role as a black woman involved in a white marriage or a white older man with a wife and kids. And it's really good. It's really messy, and it's just very complex. Similarly, now, I have to recommend Akwaeke Emezi's notebook, You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. I couldn't help but feel similarities between these 2, because if you like Luster, I think you'd love this. It is romance, but it is super messy. It delves into some really complicated scenarios with characters who are very imperfect and have some learning to do. If anything, while you may not sympathize with our main characters who do some very questionable things, it's very empathizing. It makes you empathize for them and at least give us a different perspective of seeing this kind of scenario. If I had to pick between the two, I probably prefer Luster, if only because I feel like it's more consistent in its messiness. Yes, so if you like Luster, you like that messy romance, I think you would like You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. Same with Luster if you haven't heard of it. I feel like they're both popular to an extent. It's just You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty is newer, so that's my recommendation on the basis of Luster. Now let's recommend a book that has to do with aliens and First Contact, and that is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. Now, I'm being kind of ambitious with the recommendation because these books are very different. The scenario that I think that makes us similar is that at the core of this is a story of a first contact scenario, of dealing with aliens contacting Earth and how abstract that might be and how we might reckon with that, how the Earth would respond and how we would react to it. There's also an added component here about a celebrity YouTuber becoming popular because of that. And you could probably argue that the recommendation I'm about to give you has sort of celebrity parts to it. It's not the same. But what I think makes this book really shine is that I felt this was a more realistic take on that premise. Contact by Carl Sagan. It's the book that inspired the movie with Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey, one of my favorite movies of all time. Basically, until we find contact of aliens, we have to figure out how to interpret their message and respond and decide what to do. And who will be the person who speaks for us? Who speaks for the trees? This book was amazing because it deals with religion, belief, and the science behind this type of interaction, what it would actually be like if we were contacted by aliens. And I just felt like Hank Green's take did not work for me. So like in some ways, like they're very different books because this is an adult book, this is YA. I like this because I think it's a really good exploration of the premise of this book. And if you like the premise, I think you should really give this a shot, and hopefully you might agree that it's been done more effectively. Similarly though, I am now currently reading We Are the Ants, and I feel like there's some comparisons going on here where if you like that, you like this, but this is also a very popular book, so I'm not sure if it quite fits in the theme of this video, but nevertheless, I can see the sort of alien contact mental health type thing, because while it's not mental health going on in contact, there's the question of spirituality has some mental health aspects to it. So they also overlap. And I just feel like contact is something you should consider if you like the alien contact, light sci-fi scenario. It's not heavy sci-fi by any stretch of the imagination. And it's also educational in how we could practically expect to see a message from aliens and how we would react. Next up is going to be our last set of nonfiction. And for this one, like I don't really have a cover, Becoming, let's just show you this, now you can just put up cover here, by Michelle Obama. And this is one of my ambitious recommendations, I'm not gonna lie. Again, it's the spirit of the book, if not the entirety of it. Like, what I'm about to recommend you is also about a first lady and about her experience growing up and giving us a better look into her life, which is what Becoming is. Now, what I will say is I feel like a lot of people read Becoming because they love Michelle Obama. And that's a key part of why people love this book. But I think there's a sort of a mirrored approach to why we might look at The Matriarch, Barbara Bush and the Making of an American Dynasty by Susan Page. Susan Page is a journalist, and she's written 2 books now, one about the matriarch here, and one about the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And while I know this book is fundamentally different than Michelle Obama, in the sense that their lives were very different. Michelle Obama was a black woman who grew up, I believe, in a home that was not very wealthy, I think poverty, and she sort of had to find a place for herself by using education as a way of building a life for herself, and never really liking politics. Barbara Bush, in contrast, is this woman who I believe grew up in a rich family, ended up getting into a marriage and becoming a part of a very problematic set of presidents. And this book isn't just a way of praising her or even just shitting on her. It's instead a reflection of understanding what motivated her. Even if we don't agree with her, we can appreciate what led her to make certain decisions. Some of them good, some of them bad. Like, she wasn't impartial. She wasn't just passive. She actively tried to make a difference. And I believe we see that not just in her time with her husband, but when her son was in office, but also when Donald Trump was in office. And this book, I think, gives you a better appreciation for who she was as a woman, what she stood for, and even if you don't agree with her, which I definitely do not for most of her life, I have a better appreciation for her that I'm really glad to have, because she's often overlooked when it comes. I think the women of presidencies, the wives of the presidents, are often overlooked when they do not play a trivial part in their presidencies, at least usually. And this is the first or one of several books I'm hoping to explore about the First Ladies to better appreciate who they were. And I think Barbara Bush is someone who definitely deserves your time. If you like understanding the First Lady and what it was like for her growing up in the role she played, this is really good. I know it's a bit of a stretch coming to this from Michelle Obama's Becoming, but hear me out and just give it a shot. Unless really you just have no interest in First Ladies and you're just interested in Michelle Obama, which I get. That's why it makes this recommendation a little bit of a stretch. This next one was a book that I'm going to recommend that was one of probably be a favorite of the year. I absolutely adored it. But first, let's start with Anne Rice and Interview with the Vampire. I don't have the individual book. I have the collection, original trilogy of the Vampire Chronicles, which is Lestat, The Queen of the Damned, and the initial Interview with the Vampire, which of course inspired the movie with the same name. In that, we have the story of Lestat and Louis. Particularly, Interview with the Vampire is where he has an interview with a journalist and telling him his life turning into a vampire and what it was like to be a vampire. And it starts out with the interviewer not quite believing him until by the end of the story, he definitely believes him by the end, is what I'm trying to say. And we get a better appreciation not just for Louis, but also for the interviewer. I think the interviewer is lesser part of the story than it is of the one I'm about to recommend you, but it's definitely this really interesting look at what it means to be this sort of vampire monster immortal and what it was like to be in their position to reckon with their primal urges that they get as a vampire and just what it was like for them. Similar, but exploring, I think, very different themes, or a lot of different themes and some similar ones. It's going to be The Devourers by Introdos. This book was phenomenal. Like, I highly recommend it on its own. But in a lot of ways, I couldn't get past the similarities to Interview with the Vampire. This is essentially a story of a werewolf, which is kind of a stretch, but a werewolf telling the story of his life and his parents birthing him to a journalist, to a historian who's reading these papers, these journal entries from his parents. The way in which it's executed, like, I was skeptical at first, having a sort of ancient look at these monsters who I call werewolves. They're not really werewolves. You'll see in the story that they're actually not quite anything we've ever described, but they have similarities to monsters like werewolves that have been described previously. This is an exploration of what it means to be them. Like, it's what it means to be human, what it means to be a monster, and what it means to be prey versus the predator, right? And it also deals to an extent with gender and sexuality, because we're looking more heavily at our historian here and his relationship to the werewolf, or whatever it is, telling the story. And there is a sort of longing urge between the narrator, the historian reading this, who's sort of transcribing this narrative from these old works, basically the journalist of the story, and the one telling the story, which isn't dissimilar to Interview with the Vampire. There's a lot of queer energy, queer longing to the vampires in that story and between the vampires, and that's very prominent here. It also just deals with this sort of reckoning with what is a monster and what's not a monster, what drives people to do certain things. And I feel like I'm oversimplifying it, but just know that this book was really good, not just for the similarities it is to Interview with the Vampire, because it's really honestly very different. I think about a book that just basically takes an idea and redoes it. This is not that. This took the idea and made it wholly its own. It is wholly unique. And while it may be some overlap in the themes it explores, it's also very unique in its themes, because Introdos is themselves, I believe, from India, and there is some culture, some history going on there. So it's simultaneously this unique story about werewolves and humanity and sexuality and gender even, while also being in some ways sort of an insight into the culture from now and in the past of this terrain. And I just highly recommend it. I was so pleasantly surprised. It took me so long to read this because I was, not going to lie, I was nervous because I'm always afraid of a book that it's intimidating for whatever reason. And it is complex, but it's also, I think, extremely digestible. And, oh God, the writing too. Like Anne Rice, the writing here is so beautiful. It just devours you. As the reader, it just encapsulates you entirely, and it's just so well done. I absolutely adored this book. And finally, a book that I only just finished reading this last week, the one I'm recommending at least. This one I read last year. This is like it was a time war. A very popular book about what is it about? I always forget. Basically, there's two fighting sides of these two potential futures. We have these two quote-unquote utopias / dystopias that are fighting to make the future that they want. And at the core, we're following these two individual women who are sort of soldiers in the war for each of their fighting sides. And what happens is it's seeing their relationship, that dynamic, and how they connect to one another despite being enemies. They have this sort of fundamental connection that we see explored throughout the book, while simultaneously touching on the science fiction that's going on, the time travel that's going on, understanding not just how it works, but the two futures that they come from and how they differ. And while the story isn't really about the two utopias / dystopias, that message is there, it's very subtle. It's really about the relationship between our two soldiers. In an alternate scenario, we have The Future of Another Timeline by Annalee Newitz. And this one was good, not quite as good in my opinion, because I feel like it is very heavy in trying to explain the science, but it's fundamentally the same premise, where you have two potential futures being battled by these two factioning sides. This is less complex in its utopian future. It's more, I think, modern in what it's looking at, in the sense that you have a patriarchal attempts to get rid of women's rights and make the future more backwards, more patriarchal than it already is, which is, it's hard to imagine. Basically, it's just about preventing women's suffrage and any more progress beyond what we have already. And in some ways, it's interesting to talk about abortion being overturned in this book and thinking how you don't need time travel to overturn abortion. Just look what's happening now. And in that sense, this story was very believable. If this type of time travel existed, I very much believe that people would try to do what they're doing, try to change history to get what they want. But like I said, they wouldn't need it to make it happen. But still, it's not hard to believe. It's very in line, despite the fact that it feels almost caricature at times in the two sides it has, but I still think it has a lot to say. But without getting too big into the review here, the one thing that didn't work for me was that I felt they over-explained the time travel. But anyways, overall, good book, and very similar to the study of the Time War. Those are all the books that I have for you today on if you like this, then you should try this. I forgot a stack of books. I set this to the side, apparently, when the video failed the first time I tried recording it. So I forgot about them. This the last one, a very popular book, Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. A less popular book that I liked, not much at all, honestly, was All Our Wrong Todays by Elon Mastaya. These are both multiverse books, right? About alternate worlds intersecting with ours. And they both get critiqued. Well, this one gets critiqued by me, I'm not sure about other people. This one especially by other people. But what I'm really pulling off of is the multiverse idea. If you like multiverses, I think you should consider My Real Children by Joe Walton. Again, it's a bit of a stretch for a recommendation because these are thrillers, especially Dark Matter, but this one is very much not a thriller. This is a character piece. I thought this was a sci-fi analysis, like a sci-fi book about intersecting worlds. What it's really about is a what if. What if this woman made a decision at a certain point in her life that branched? She went in a certain direction that would determine the type of life she lived. At the same time, the society she lives in makes certain choices as well alongside her, not necessarily because of it, just in correlation with it. And what we see these branching societies that have their benefits and their cons. And it's interesting to study how small changes, small choices could have such big impact long term on a personal level and on a societal level. This book really shines when it comes to how it uses the multiverse theory, multiverse idea, which is why I think it's really worth exploring, really worth considering. Not just because it's fun for a multiverse story, but also why we love multiverse stories, not just because they're exciting, but because they have the potential to really make you think. And this one definitely does that. Highly recommend. Hopefully you found something that interests you. Let me know in the comments if you think you might pick any of these up, or if any of these sound new to you. I'd love to hear that, even if you don't know if you're going to read it. I just love to know how well of a list this was, basically. Let me know your thoughts. And again, if you have any ideas for any future video possibilities, let me know, and I'll be happy to give it a try. And as always, have a great day, stay safe, and thanks for watching. Goodbye.